Okay, first we're gonna find out why they are hunting for the anonymous cartoonist who transformed pop culture, and we got to see how he transformed pop culture. But look at me being a sexist because I said he. It could be a woman. Who knows? I don't know. Please, internet. I was joking. Let's get it.
Most popular American to ever work in the medium of comic books. It's not Stan Lee or Jack Kirby.
Stan
it's
Lee,
not Todd
Jack
McFarlane
Kirby's
or
crazy.
Jim Lee. It's an artist most people couldn't even name. That's because this man, arguably the most influential comic artist in American history, was forced to remain anonymous by the Disney Corporation.
It was the Pixar person. It's Pixar, ain't it? Hey, Alex Bell coming out with the Pixar theory. Hold on now.
His name deserves to be known. This is his story.
Okay.
Let's begin in an unusual place. In 1946, at a YMCA in Osaka, Japan, where a young Japanese medical student was practicing
is
piano,
really
an American soldier heard
like
him
that when
playing
it comes
and came
to
in to
content.
listen. After the student finished, the soldier responded by singing an opera. Through their shared love of music, the two became friends. The medical student was an amateur artist and offered to draw a portrait of the American soldier. As a thank you for that portrait, the soldier brought the medical student a stack of American comics. That stack of comics changed his life. He would later say of the soldier, "My friendship with him might have been short, but it became the reason I decided to become..."
Hold up. So was Japan influenced by American comics that led to anime? Hold on. Hey, hold on. Don't let me fight. Boy, the internet will break if America spawns as the starting point of anime. Look,
a manga artist. And that young man's name was Osamu Tezuka. If that name sounds familiar, it's because Tezuka is regularly referred to as the god of manga and would be the single largest and most influential individual in the creation of manga as we know it today. But what matters for this story is what was in that stack of American comics that inspired Tezuka to change the course of history. For a long time, no one seemed to know or care what he had been reading. But thanks to the diligent work of comic scholar Ryan Holmberg, we actually have a good idea. In 2012, Holmberg gained access to Tezuka's American comic collection and published a list of what he found, as well as closely studying Tezuka's early work for references to American comics. So what was it that inspired Tezuka? He famously never had much interest in superhero comics or even American crime or horror comics. No, the comics that held the largest spot in his collection were Disney comics, mainly those starring Donald Duck.
Bro, I told y'all Walt Disney he has a manga. Walt Disney knows where the One Piece is, bro. I'm telling you. Y'all could call me a liar if y'all think look, that castle.
Tezuka wasn't alone in being enamored and inspired by the Donald Duck comics. Around the world, people in the 1940s and 1950s had noticed their astoundingly high quality, clearly all being created by the hand of a single, brilliant artist. Only that brilliant artist was never credited, so dedicated fans around the world made up their own names for him. The Good Artist, the Good Duck Artist, or simply, the Duck Man. Now hold on, before you start thinking I'm some weird Disney adult, let me explain why this all matters. Because sometimes it feels like comic history gets rewritten a little bit. While superhero comics dominate the American comic market today, it's easy to forget that that wasn't always the case. In the 1940s and 50s, funny animal books were both common and extremely popular.
The Jungle Book, that's what I remember
Disney comics, especially the Donald Duck comics drawn by the Duck Man. This series,
like y'all remember the old Disney books? They were like 12 pages. They had like the gold. What is that? The back of the book, or what is that thing that holds the book together? Like the pages open like this part. It was like gold. They had like Jungle Book, Winnie the Pooh, all of that. Dog.
That his stories appeared in was not only the best-selling comic, but the second best-selling periodical in the country, outselling every single newspaper, behind only Reader's Digest. In the early 1950s, the Duckman was selling 3 million comics every single month, and yet no one knew his name. Fans, of course, had tried to find out his name, but any requests sent to the publisher were either denied or unanswered. You see, Disney was intent on keeping alive the myth that Walt Disney himself personally drew the comics. That's not a joke. Other artists regularly signed Walt's signature to their own work.
That's crazy.
And while many kids really believed that myth, reality was just about the opposite. Some artists would later claim that Walt didn't even read the comic books. But after more than a decade of speculation, the Duckman's fans were determined to find out his identity. One of those fans was named Malcolm Willits, and Willits had a plan to break through Disney's Stonewall and finally get the real name of the Duckman. But hold on.
Hold on. We gotta put some mods in the chat real quick. Hold on.
Second, before we get into Willits and his plan, we need to talk about why this matters. Why did anyone then, or why should we today, even care about
Hold
who draws the Donald Duck comic? Let me ask you another question. Are comics art? Because this, I believe, is the question at the heart of the hunt for the Duckman. Because how can an artist who doesn't get credit for their work be considered a true artist, whose work is printed on low-quality newsprint, whose original drawings are destroyed, whose work isn't collected in books, whose subjects are characters created and owned by a giant corporation? That sounds like disposable mass media, not art. But the Duckman's fans believed his work was important, and they knew that if nothing was known about him, written about him, discovered about him, his memory would be lost to time, as the only printed copies of his work turned yellow and ended up in landfills. So this begs another question. Why did so many people feel so strongly about these Duck comics? Well, here's the thing. The Duckman wasn't only fabulously popular, he was also really, really good at making comics. This is technically a comic channel, so let's actually look at these comics, because they might not be exactly what you're expecting. Maybe you're expecting the early Disney short films, where Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse would find themselves in a comic situation, and then a series of visual gags would expand from that situation and wrap up a few minutes later. But the Duck comics were actually, at their best, rip-roaring, edge-of-your-seat, globe-trotting comic adventures. They feel less like Steamboat Willie and more like Indiana Jones or Star Wars. Or should I say, Indiana Jones and Star Wars
come back soon,
feel
hopefully.
like the Duck comics. Because both George Lucas and Steven Spielberg grew up reading and are vocal fans of the Duckman. This famous sequence from Raiders of the Lost Ark is a direct homage to the Duck comics. And, unlike the Disney cartoons, the Duck comics are filled with a cast of complex characters. The Duckman gives Donald, Huey, Dewey, and Louie more defined personalities. He creates Duckburg and fills it with new characters, most famously Scrooge McDuck. And Duckburg is more than just a background. It's a place so brimming with characters and details that it feels real and lived in.
That's
like
crazy.
The Simpsons Springfield. Or should I say, Springfield feels like Duckburg. That's right, Matt Groening is another vocal fan of the Duckman. The Duck comics are also genuinely funny. Despite the sense of adventure, they never avoid a good gag. And the gags work. The Duckman uses funny animals to produce sharp commentary on society and our shared human existence. In that way, they're a lot like the works of a very different cartoonist, Robert Crumb, who would also use— Okay, you probably see where this is going. Yes, R. Crumb, the genius of perverse and boundary-pushing underground comics, has cited the Duckman as one of his main influences, calling him one of the rare cartoonists to combine great art with—
Isn't Fritz the Cat was the first version of Fritz the Cat was the first version of R34, right? Or something like that. Hey, if you don't know what R34 is, don't look it up.
Man is one of his main influences, calling him one of the rare cartoonists to combine great art with great storytelling. So finally, let's talk about that great storytelling. There's a reason I started this video with Tezuka, because if there's anywhere today I can see the Duckman's influence, it's in manga. Tezuka would become an avid fan of the Duckman, putting Donald Duck in his own comics and traveling to America to pay great sums for copies of the Duckman's work. And while Tezuka took what the Duckman began and pushed it into the stratosphere, it's hard not to see the Duckman's large-eyed characters express—
So Walt Disney, low-key, was the start of anime? They don't want to hear this. The internet is going to tear in half, all right? They find out that Walt Disney is a large proponent of the beginning of anime. It's over with. It's over. I can see the chats right now. Oh my God. Keyboard components flying everywhere. Oh man.
faces, dynamic, rubbery body language, and his contrasting use of detail all alive in Tezuka's work, as well as in the manga industry he helped give birth to. Even when I open manga from much later, like Dragon Ball or One Piece by artists who, to my knowledge, have never read a Donald Duck comic, I see the Duckman's influence in those half-page, scene-setting splashes, the big eyes, expressive faces, the sense of motion and pacing. But here's the best thing about the Duckman.
That's crazy.
None of this matters. He does everything so well that when you read one of his comics, all of that technique just disappears as you are drawn into the story. It's the kind of thing you see in movies by Pixar or Ghibli or Spielberg, or like in Nintendo games, where the level of technical craft is so high that it just disappears completely, and what you're left with is a pure, magical experience. The search for the Duckman mattered because people needed to know, how did he do this? What were his methods of working? Who influenced him? If they didn't find him, all of that knowledge would be lost to history. So Malcolm Willits made his plan. In 1950, like so many others, he had written a letter to the publisher asking for the name of the Duckman, and like all of those others, he had been ignored. So a few years later, when he was running a fanzine called Destiny, he wrote a long, flattering article about Walt Disney to use as bait. as he called it. He mailed that glowing article to Disney's corporate offices, along with a request to interview the Duckman in a future issue of his fanzine. Well, someone at Disney fell for Willits' ploy, because a few weeks later, he received this letter. For the first time in history, someone outside the industry knew the name of the Duckman. His name was Carl Barks, and he lived in a small desert town outside of Los Angeles.
Oh, that's crazy.
But Willits was too busy, or perhaps too nervous, to write to the Duckman himself. But a few years later, Willits shared the name of the Duckman with fellow fan John Spicer, who, in 1960, finally wrote the world's first fan letter to Carl Barks. For a long time, he got no response. But finally, a letter came back, and what that letter said was quite surprising. Barks opens his letter, admitting that he hadn't written back right away because he was worried that this fan letter was a prank. Despite writing the Donald Duck comic for 17 years, the publisher had only ever forwarded him 3 letters, 2 of which were complaints. This is absolutely insane. Not only did the outside world not know the name of the Duckman, but the Duckman himself, the most popular comic artist in the world, had no idea how popular and beloved his work was. So, after doing some research, Barks had decided that maybe Spicer's letter was genuine, and he cautiously decided to respond. But Carl Barks was nearly 60 years old. He was approaching the end of his career, admitting in his letter, "If in the future you notice a dropping off in quality of my stories, don't be surprised. The mind is not a bottomless well of new ideas,
that's a fact,
and mine is about pumped dry." It was just a glimmer of who this genius might be, of his attitude towards his own work. But now, his name was out there, and began to be traded among fans. Soon, Willits would go to California to conduct the world's first interview with Barks, to finally get the story behind this brilliant man.
But you know how crazy it has to be for them to be blocking, like, hey, we don't want to show you none of your fan letters, keep working, okay? Because sometimes you'll begin to celebrate, and then you won't have the output of what you're doing. You know what I'm saying? So maybe that's what Disney's plan was, but L plan, man, gotta make the people doing the work happy.
What would he be like? An introverted genius like George Harriman, a blustery showman like Stan Lee, a tortured artist like Wally Wood? Well, unfortunately, the world would have to wait to find out. Because after Willits conducted his interview, the Disney company refused to allow him to publish it. Why? Well, for the same old reason. Kids need to believe that Disney wrote the stories himself. Willits and his colleagues would be forced to sit on that interview until 1968, after Walt had died. And sadly, in the intervening years, Barks had retired from drawing comics before most of the world even knew of his existence. But finally, the world would know his name, would learn the story of one of the most important figures in 20th century American art. His life was about to change dramatically. But before we get into that, let's finally meet Carl Barks.
And I realized that
let's see what Carl talking about,
to sell cartoons, you have to have an idea behind them, a little bit of writing to go along with them. So I began developing the art of writing a little humor to go with my cartoons.
The Barks Willits interviewed wasn't a recluse, a torture genius, a showboat, or anything wild. In fact, Barks seems to defy all popular notions of what a genius artist should be like.
He was really in it for the love.
He was a older man in his early 60s with a slow, deliberate way of talking with a country twang and a gentle sense of humor. He described himself as a pseudo-cowboy, and that certainly wasn't far off. See, Barks had always wanted to be a cartoonist, but life seemed to constantly have other plans for him. He was born about as far from the world of art as possible, on a ranch in Oregon.
But that's where the best art come from. The best art come from the place where people get the longest to be able to think about their art, okay? That's just a fact. Because once you are in a place where you got to think about life and not art, you start creating life instead of art. But art imitate. Listen, we got metaphors out here, boy.
In 1901,
he's cooking.
The cartooning bolt of lightning hit him early in the one-room schoolhouse he attended. A boy in his class had taken a correspondence course on how to draw cartoons, and Barks was obsessed, leaning over his desk and watching him draw his little caricatures. Barks wanted to do the same thing, but he wasn't from a family that valued that kind of thing. His father was a homesteader and a man of few words. The only book he read was the Bible. Barks and his brother were expected to help out on the farm, and although Barks loved school and learning, life at home often kept him away. But Barks was obsessed with drawing. He wanted to be a cartoonist, not a farmer. Finally, after a few years, his father relented and allowed him to enroll in a correspondence course on cartooning. But luck, again, was against Barks, because soon after, his mother passed away. Barks was forced not only to drop the cartooning course, but drop out of school entirely so he could go to work and help support his family.
See, I told you, once life start, you need to...
The boy who loved learning would never get any formal education past the 8th grade. But that correspondence course, short as it was, gave him the foundation
That's all
to
he
study
needed.
the comic strips he read. Every Sunday, he would pore over the San Francisco Examiner, studying and imitating the styles of the great early cartoonists like Winsor McCay, Roy Crane, and E.C. Seeger. And so, over the next 2 years, he saved up his money and at 17 years old, told his father he was going to San Francisco to try and get a job in cartooning. He made it to San Francisco, but the papers were stacked with great cartoonists, and with many men returning from World War I, no one had interest in an untrained kid. Like it does for so many people, life forced him to put his dream aside and focus on his day-to-day existence. He worked
that boy
whatever
had that
jobs he could
drip, though.
find, from a print
He
shop
had
to
it
logging.
on.
He got married and had kids, but in the evenings, when he had time, he still worked away at his cartoons and would mail them off to papers and magazines. And then, at 28 years old, 11 years after he left
remember
home,
that.
he finally sold his first cartoon. It was to a small humor magazine called the Calgary Eye Opener. Finally, things were starting to happen for him, but yet again, his personal life had other plans. His wife had no interest in his cartooning career. She wanted to spend their evenings seeing friends, living life, but Barks wanted to spend that time at home at his drawing board. Barks wouldn't give up on his dream now that it was in sight, and ended up separating from his wife and ultimately losing touch with his daughters. He quit his job to focus on selling his cartoons, mainly to the Eye Opener, but his finances were deteriorating. It got so bad that he tried to sell his overcoat, but it was too warm and no one would buy it. Finally,
That's
he ended
crazy.
up pawning his dishware so he could have enough money to eat and to send a telegram to the Eye Opener asking for more money. But then he
Real
got
bag
a
chaser
break.
right there, boy.
See, the Eye Opener was so poorly run that the drunken editor printed a totally unfinished issue and no one even noticed. The management needed stability, and they saw that Barks was, in his own words, a hard-working son of a gun, so they sent him a telegram offering him a full-time job. Once again,
Telegram.
he left his old life behind to start a new chapter in his pursuit to become a cartoonist. Now, the Eye Opener was not the San Francisco Examiner. It was filled with racy images, cheap gags, often about booze or women, and a lot of racist caricatures that I won't be showing here. This might not have been the prestigious cartooning career that Barks had envisioned, but finally, at 32 years old, he was a full-time cartoonist. And that might have been enough for him, but then he saw something that changed his life. An article about how the Walt Disney Studio, whose short films had become incredibly popular over the past few years, was struggling to find animators as it began production on its first feature film. So Barks put a bunch of his best Eye Opener cartoons in an envelope and mailed it off to Disney. And right away, a letter came back. Disney offered him a job, but deciding to take that job wouldn't be easy. When the Eye Opener found out about Disney, they offered him a sizable raise, double what Disney would pay him. And the job at Disney was...
Hey, what y'all doing at that point? Disney call you, they say, look, we got a bag for you. In today's terms, they probably offer him like 100,000. All right, we're gonna give you 100,000 to come in here. And then your job come back and say, hey, look, we need you right here. We're going to give you 200,000. Who you staying with? You loyal to the soil? Or you going to try to run it up over there at Disney? Which one y'all taking?
hardly a guarantee of success. See, Disney at this time was home to the best commercial artists in the world. Barks might have had a job offer, but that offer was more of a trial. Disney had a strict training regimen, and anyone who couldn't keep pace was promptly cut. You could easily end up far from home and unemployed. But Barks thought it was worth the risk. He knew there was no future at the Eye Opener, but he just might have a future at Disney. So once again, he upended his life and pursued his dreams.
Certified bag chaser, all right? He said, look, y'all might be able to give me 200,000 now, but if I go to Disney and start cooking, I'm going to be up a couple mil.
Fortunately, Barks found Disney difficult almost right away. He was 34, a decade older than everyone else in his class of animators. The pace of work was intense, with art classes at night and drawing assignments all day.
That's
like all
crazy.
beginning artists, he was assigned to work on the in-betweens. This work was difficult and repetitive, and Barks was having a tough time keeping up with his younger classmates. It seemed coming out to Disney had been a mistake. Barks was sure he was going to be fired any day.
Boy, ain't no
But
way.
Disney
I know they
also
fingers
had a
just like
policy
this
of asking
today.
the whole company to contribute to each film they worked on. And just like he had when he was trying to get into cartooning, Barks sent in submissions. Lots of submissions. Finally, he sent in this gag to the team working on a new Donald Duck short. Walt himself loved it and paid Barks $50 for it. But more importantly, Walt realized that Barks' skill was in writing, not drawing, and moved him into the story unit for the Donald
real
Duck
one.
shorts. Barks' career at Disney was saved. Barks' time at Disney gives us another keen insight into his personality. While his peers at Disney would characterize him as a hillbilly who was interested in no music that wasn't Roy Rogers, no books besides westerns, by night, Barks was studying, learning from grammar books or history books, trying to give himself the education that he had sorely missed out on in school. And that work paid off. Over the next 7 years, he worked on 35 Donald Duck short films, some
I
of the
can't
most
draw to save my
popular
life. I
films
can't draw
Disney
either.
produced during this time. It seemed like Barks had finally found a job that suited him, until things started to change. As World War II began, budgets were being cut across the studio, and animators assigned to work on projects in support of the war. The animators had gone on strike, and
That's
the atmosphere
crazy.
of the studio
There
was
are no
changing. They had moved to
strings on me.
Burbank, and the air quality at the new studio bothered Barks' sensitive sinuses. He was thinking about quitting. But then, almost as an afterthought, came the assignment that changed his life. See, at this time in 1942, the comic book craze was in full swing. One of the
Captain
bigger
Marvel?
comic publishers, Western, sought to capitalize on this popularity by licensing Disney characters for a line of their own comic books. At first, these Disney comic books were largely reprints of older Disney newspaper strips. But by 1942, they were running out of newspaper strips to reprint. So they asked the studio, do you have anyone who could draw an original comic? This led them to the Donald Duck department. So Carl Barks and fellow Duckman Jack Hanna adapted an unfinished Mickey Mouse film into the 64-page Donald Duck Finds Pirate Gold. Carl Barks was 40 years old. He had
Donald Duck Finds Pirate Gold. The number one, by most stretches of people, I got a DBZ, RIP Toriyama, you know what I'm saying? But right now, the number one anime is doing what? Hey, let me find out Walt was in there cooking. All right, he is cooking right now.
He had no idea the importance of that comic. In fact, a few months later, he quit Disney to raise chickens in the desert where the air was better for his sinuses. But, as luck would have it, the comic publishers needed more comics, so they tracked down Barks and sent him another script to draw.
Got a snail
He
on
ended up
his
changing
shoes.
and reworking it so much, they asked if he would do another and just write that one himself. And so he did. And so, in 1942, for $12.50 a page, he began on his 24-year
$12.50
journey
a page?
drawing Donald Duck comics. And here, finally, we can begin to
How long
answer
does it
some
take
of our
people to draw a
questions from
page?
earlier, to start to understand what made Barks so successful. Barks was working in an era when American comics were moving toward assembly line production and stricter editorial oversight, but Barks' situation couldn't have been more different. He had quickly gained the trust of his publisher and was allowed to create everything entirely himself, with only his wife's occasional help on inking or lettering. He didn't
I
submit
think Demon Slayer is a little bit. My girlfriend, she's seen a poster of Demon Slayer. She seemed like she might be interested, so I might rewatch it. But season 1 did not grab me like it was supposed to. Okay, season 2 watched like 2 episodes and kind of fell off Demon Slayer, so I might circle back to Demon Slayer if she wants to watch it.
scripts for approval, and he rarely got notes back on his
Hitman put on
drawing.
a hat
He
today?
received a page count, produced a
Blast was
story,
good.
and turned it in. But beyond just having no editorial direction, he also had no insight into the reception his work had. Barks later speculated that this was because the publisher worried that if he realized how popular he was, he might ask for a raise. All he knew is that if he kept getting hired, he must be doing okay. But Barks turned that into a superpower. He would say that he was, in fact, glad he wasn't receiving fan mail because he might have written stories to please the letter writers rather than to please himself. I would argue that despite
That's the number one thing about content creation. All right, when you figure out something can make you money or can make you popular, a lot of people will turn from making good art to making money to survive. And you got to get a good balance because your talent is what got you to people in the first place. So keep doing what you're doing and it will grow. I'm out here giving life lessons, okay? Don't chase the bag because the bag is going to lead you to a lifelong term of work, okay? But if you keep working, you might get free.
his massive popularity, despite being employed by a huge corporation, despite often referring to himself as a hack, Barks'
Keep working at your art. You will be free.
working style resembled more that of an independent fine artist than it did someone working in mass entertainment. And while this independent approach was half of his formula, the other half was the incredibly high standard of quality he held himself to. His publisher, his fellow artists, everyone around him seemed to believe that comic books were just a passing craze. The other artists in the industry generally wanted to do the minimum effort to get a story by their editor and to churn out as many pages as fast as possible. But Barks wanted to make his story worth the reader's dime. And so he would work his stories back and forward, often rereading and rewriting scripts 10 or 20 times. He would use his grammar books to find ways to cut down the dialogue to be as short and punchy as possible. He even counted the syllables in each line to make sure they read smoothly, like lines of
My man was
prose
out here
poetry.
doing haikus.
We also know from his time at Disney that Barks wasn't a natural when it came to illustration. He claims that he did as much erasing as he did drawing, penciling each page and erasing it and penciling it again until he got it just right. And then he would paste up his pages on a big board like they did at Disney, and he wouldn't hesitate to rework them or throw them away entirely if he felt they weren't perfect.
Oh,
Throwing
wow.
away inked, completed work just because he thought he could be a little better, a little funnier. This is a guy who's getting paid by the page.
Five
He
Nights
got
at
no
Freddy's Security
fans or
Breach.
sales reports confirming that this work was even worth it. What was motivating Barks to work so hard? Well, Barks had spent many years at hard, laborious jobs and had always valued hard work. That much is clear. He also seemed to be grateful to have a job in cartooning, just as he had always dreamed of as a child. But beyond that, Barks respected his readers, their intelligence and their taste, even if they were mostly kids. And he respected the medium of comics. In interviews years before the term graphic novel even existed, Barks dreamed that someday comics might be printed in hardcover books on high-quality paper and be considered fine literature. But that was not the world Barks lived in. And sadly, Barks may have had another, more personal reason for throwing himself into his work. You see, while the Ducks traveled around the globe, Barks, by his own admission...
The Ducks traveled around the world on a boat, collecting treasure. Chat. Are we finding out that Donald Duck is Luffy? Come on now.
Had never been anywhere. When asked about it, he would point to his stack of National Geographics and say, "That's my travels right there." But those fantastic journeys he sent the Ducks on were an escape not just for his readers, but a chance for Barks to escape his difficult home life. During this time, his second wife had become a serious alcoholic, prone to violent fits in which she would smash things around the house and destroy his artwork. But the worse things got at home, the more his...
Smashing his artwork? Yo, I'm jumping off the top rope, okay? So, listen.
Imagination seemed to come to life. Barks would produce some of his greatest stories at the motel where he would go to escape her violent rages. They would finally divorce, and Barks would move out, bring only his clothes, his art supplies, and his collection of National Geographic magazines. But it was during this difficult period of his divorce that he created the Beagle Boys, Uncle Scrooge's Money Bin, and Gyro Gear Loose. Barks soon remarried a fellow artist named Garay who had been assisting him with inking, and finally it seemed that his personal life was in order. But sadly, the difficulties were just ramping up in his professional life. Despite Barks' enthusiasm for his work, he did eventually come up against the forces of working at a big company. While many of Barks' greatest stories were the longer, standalone Scrooge or Donald adventures, the publisher began moving away from them, limiting Barks mainly to the 10-page stories, which curtailed his imagination. They also switched to lower quality paper. For some artists, this might not be a big deal, but for Barks, this was devastating. As we know, Barks would spend a lot of time erasing and reworking his pencils, but on this cheap paper, his pencils would cut grooves, so even after erasing, his pencil would fall back in the same groove over and over. It became impossible for him to rework his drawings to perfection as he previously had. And those big, beautiful splashes he would spend days on, the publisher realized that they could cut them out and replace them with ads. Barks decided to stop drawing them altogether. He was feeling defeated. While his work from this time still has merit, he would admit that he stopped putting as much effort into it. Eventually, Barks began to feel his stories weren't worth the dime anymore. He was 61 years old, and while he had been paid for his work, he had no money left for retirement. He was ready to quit, to figure out a new career. Because
and this is why you got to credit companies like, you know what I'm saying? Shout out to YouTube. You can work, build your catalog. They get their little piece, and your contributions come back to you, and they built a system for that to happen. So shout out to YouTube, man. You know, but back then you had people buying up. Yo, give me that. Once you sell it, you can never get it back. That's why licensing is important. All of that great stuff, immaculate. But if you sell it, it's over with.
He had no idea how popular he was. That is, until a letter from a fan arrived and changed his life. After the publication of Willett's interview in 1968, which was accompanied by a short biography of Barks by Michael Barrier, his name began to grow and gain recognition in fan circles. But while Barks gained praise, he was still struggling financially. He ends his interview with Willett's by admitting that he's currently painting a local high school for $300, an amount that, to an old retired hack, looks as big as Uncle Scrooge's money bin. But Barks' fans worked tirelessly to get him the recognition he deserved, to elevate his reputation to something resembling a true artist. And then, in 1971, a fan requested an oil painting of the Ducks. Barks asked for Disney's permission, and they agreed. Once people saw it, a craze began. Immediately, Barks had a waiting list years long for oil.
See, but that's also the benefit of working with people. They can blow your name up so big that you can live off your name forever. Oh no.
Oil paintings of the Ducks. Over time, the prices of these pieces would grow to well over 6 figures. I do find it ironic that after all this talk about comics as art, that the man who worked so hard to elevate the status of comics would finally become wealthy in his 70s, selling oil paintings to fine art collectors. But Barks' story doesn't end there. In the 70s, he finally began to be invited to comic conventions and to take his place among the comic book celebrities.
If I hadn't stayed home, I would never have written the stories. But I stayed home and worked. And now I get all this praise and thank yous from people.
Yo, shout out to him, man. That's fire.
I didn't waste my time.
And thanks to my friends at IakuWeb who helped me out by researching Barks in Japanese sources, we know that at Comic-Con in 1980, Barks actually got to meet arguably his most influential fan, Osamu Tezuka. The two had become friends, with Barks gifting Tezuka an original drawing and Tezuka sending Barks this adorable holiday card. And then, in the 1980s, the man who 30 years earlier dreamed that comics might someday be printed hardbound on nice paper saw his own work given that very treatment. Today, his work is available in these absolutely beautiful editions from Fantagraphics, just as they deserve to be. But to end this story, at 94 years old, Barks finally got to travel overseas. That small boy who dreamed of being a cartoonist, who didn't draw his first comic book until he was 40 years old, was now, at 94 years old, welcomed by rapturous crowds in distant countries and sat in numerous interviews where foreign reporters unironically compared him to William Shakespeare.
Like another Shakespeare.
Low key, because they got King James, not LeBron James. He's King James, but the other King James, you know what I'm saying? Hey, Shakespeare. Hold on, was it? What? Yeah. Shakespeare, I need you to write a book for me. We ain't got to talk about what the book was, though.
Your stories will continue to live, be read and enjoyed by generations to come. Do you ever think about that?
Well, I often hope that will happen. Yeah, it is a pleasant thing to sort of get a swelled head once in a while and think that I have written something that is undying literature and will go on into infinity. But I have been disappointed in so many of such pipe dreams that I don't push it very far.
That's crazy.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, you can really help out by liking, subscribing, or leaving a comment below. And subscribe to IakuWeb as well. Barks' story is a reminder of the powerful, positive impact fandoms can have. Both Barks' own story and this video would not have been possible without fans like Spicer, Willits, Barrier, Don and Maggie Thompson, and so many others, including artists like Don Rosa and Don Yeeps, who've continued his legacy. If you want to get deeper into Barks' story, I really recommend Donald Alt's collection of interviews with him, as well as Michael Barrier's funny books, both of which I relied on heavily making this video. Thank you guys so much.
Bro, that's all we trying to tell people. Yes, we watched the Funkland videos about Disney, whatever, you know. But like Disney, they're cooking. They're cooking. We know. A lot of people have benefited from the existence of Mr. WALT, okay? So you can't really, hey, shout out Carl Barks, man. Let me find out he created the manga. He's the reason we got anime today. So all them people who was like, yo, Naruto raised me, Bleach raised me, it's better over. Let's relax and realize where it came from, okay? But then again, you know what I'm saying? The hieroglyphics, aren't those technically like comic books? Who knows, okay? So, hey, this was a banger, man. Whoever Romance Roach requested this, this was a banger.